Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Ted Walk. I'm with the PHMC Publication and Sales Division, and on behalf of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission and Pennsylvania Heritage Society, I welcome you to today's presentation. As I mentioned the Society, each of you should have received a complimentary copy of our fall edition. This is our latest issue of Pennsylvania Heritage Magazine, and it is the core membership benefit of becoming a member of the Heritage Society. The magazine alone is worth the price of membership, and I encourage you to go to paheritage.org to know more about membership and to become a member of the Society. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Mary Shafer. Ms. Shafer is a full-time writer whose comprehensive documentary, published in 2005, Devastation on the Delaware, Stories and Images of the Deadly Flood of 1955, sold its initial 2,500 copies in just 42 days. Her book went on to be recognized by Writer's Notes magazine as Best Reference Book of 2006 and awarded as a finalist in USABookNews.com's Best Book Awards. She is currently working on an updated version of the book for 2010. Ms. Shafer is a member of many literary and historical organizations and the aforementioned Pennsylvania Heritage Society. The subject of her book, The Flood of August 18th through the 20th, 1955, is a compelling read which includes many first-person accounts and, as advertised, many before published photos from many private collections. Today's presentation will no doubt be equally compelling. In addition to her presentation, and after her presentation, Ms. Shafer will be here for a question and answer session as well as a book signing. Thank you again for attending today's presentation, and I'd like to introduce to you Mary Shafer.
Thanks, Ted. I'd like to, first of all, thank the Society for inviting me to speak. It's really an honor. I've been a member of the Society for quite a while, and I've never been invited to the Capitol before, so this is big time. Excuse me. I'm going to give you a shortened version of what I usually do because I understand I'm fitting into your lunch hour, so I hope you'll find the time well spent and enjoy yourself. So what we have is we're starting on August 12th of 1955. Coming out of the Atlantic Ocean, we have training hurricanes, training being the engine and the caboose. We've got Connie in front and Diane in the back. Any of you that are weather aficionados like I am know that this is not actually Connie and Diane because we didn't have vapor image satellite back then. But this is a very close approximation of the two storms. And we're in the Delaware Valley. The farmers were really glad to see these storms coming because we were at the end of the worst drought we had ever had in 30 years. And they were thinking we might still be able to get our crops in. Connie dumped 7 to 10 inches of rain up and down the Delaware Valley. And even with all that rain, we had been so dry that all it did was bring the waterways to bank full. There was very little flooding. And everybody was thrilled, but they would find out that this was a case of be careful what you pray for. So this is the path of Connie. She came on at the Carolinas, came up just about to Philly, and right about then she decided she's going to take a little tour up out over the Great Lakes. And she was carrying so much water in her still that by the time she got up into Ontario, she still killed 3 people with her rain. She had killed 283 people down in the Carolinas. It was a big mess down there. And I can guarantee you they were not thrilled to see Diane coming right after that. But Diane did come immediately on the heels of Connie, and again this is a recreation, but you can see where she came on pretty much within about 20 miles of the landfall. Both of them had been Category 3 hurricanes, and I believe Connie had been a 4, but by the time they got to landfall they were only Category 1. And this was a problem because in 1955 everybody believed, including meteorologists, that the biggest threat from a hurricane was the wind. It's understandable because the previous year, those of you who are alive will remember Hazel, who actually ripped out trees in the White House lawn. And it was a very frightening thing for a lot of people. So because there wasn't a lot of wind, people weren't paying a whole lot of attention to these storms. The thing is that for a couple of days, actually about a week before they came on shore, the girls went right out here and did a little, what you might call do-si-do. The fancy name is the Fujiwara Effect, which means when there are two storms that are within close proximity to each other, they tend to pull each other into their circulations. But if you think of the do-si-do, that's really what they were doing. It was swing your partner, and they did this for about a week. The problem is that the ocean temperature was about sometimes up to 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but you need 80 degrees on the surface to have a hurricane to begin with. Every degree Fahrenheit after that churns up enough electricity to light New York City for a year. That's the kind of energy that you would get out of that storm. So it's a really powerful engine. So you need the heat and you need the moisture, and they had plenty of both. And when they sat out over that, that's when they sucked up all this water. So if you can imagine what they came on shore as was like two huge, amazing, whirling sponges that were just squeezing themselves dry over the land. And then this is Connie's, or Diane's track, and you'll see that she did the same thing. She came on, she came up, started swinging over to Philly, but instead of following Connie, which was what everyone expected her to do, overnight an Alberta clipper came down out of Canada and pushed her so that she stayed where she was, and essentially she went right up the Delaware Valley. Now that's a problem because the Delaware Valley already is a major watershed, and this storm went right up the center of it from Philly all the way up to Mount Pocono, so essentially dropped as much water as it possibly could have done, not just on the river, but on both sides in the tributaries, and it was just not going to be a good place to be at that time. The problem was about 11 o'clock that night, because her winds died down, they stopped issuing advisories on her from the Weather Bureau, which is what the Weather Service was called at the time. And because of that, I mean, if you would have picked up the Philadelphia Inquirer that morning, there was a little 2-inch column ad, or article in the lower right-hand corner of the front page. It said, "Tired Diane puffs way into Virginia." You know, not exactly something that's going to strike terror into the hearts of men. So people were just kind of brushing her off, and that was a big mistake. So what she did was, what had previously been the eye of the storm, moved up the Delaware Valley, got directly over Mount Pocono and ran into that cold front and stopped. And she sat there for 12 hours, dumping at least 1 and sometimes up to 2 inches in an hour for 12 hours. It's just really, really insane. So what you're looking at here is downtown Hawley, and the back of that little garage there got ripped off by the creek that ran through there, Middle Creek. And in fact, from right where this picture was taken, a gentleman was taking a photograph. He was a merchant in town, and he was standing there, and that water came so close and so fast, it scoured the ground out from under him. He dropped into the creek, and he died. They never did find him. And in Greentown, a little further down, whole families were actually washed out of their beds in the middle of the night. In fact, whole houses were actually washed away. You got to keep in mind that we're talking about the Poconos, so the land is like this, so everything runs down. It was already saturated from Connie. There was no place for this water to soak in, so it all ran off. And the biggest watershed up there is the Broadhead Creek, although the Greentown and the Wallenpaupack come out of there, and Paradise Creek as well. They are all very active streams, and they really, really made a mess of things. So what you're looking at here is a party that went out to find the bodies and bring them out, because it was still so bad that all the bridges had been washed out. There were 42 bridges lost during this storm, and they couldn't get any of the vehicles in there. So it was either, Shanks Mare, or it was the helicopter. And unfortunately, those helicopters did recover a lot of bodies. People ask, how many people actually died here? In the Delaware Valley from the Hurricane Diane flood was 99 people. 88 of those were on the Pennsylvania side. The other ones were in New Jersey. And of the 88 on the Pennsylvania side, 78 of those were in Monroe County alone. And what you're looking at here is one of the helicopters that was recovering bodies from an incident that I'll describe in a little bit. And that would be here. And this is what was called at the time Camp Davis by the media. It's actually called Davis Cabins. Right here is where I'm going to be talking about. This area right here is Pine Brook Bible Conference. At the time, was owned by Percy Crawford, who was the original televangelist, only he was on radio because most people didn't have TVs yet. And that's another problem that made this whole event so hard, was that our communications network was really not great. You have to remember, we didn't have TV, we didn't obviously have the Weather Channel, we didn't have weathertainment. People just really didn't know what was going on. And when they did know what was going on, they heard it on AM radio, they heard it late, And then the only way we had to communicate the problem was through a telephone line, which was not a cell phone. It was usually one of those big, black, ugly princess things that if it hit you in the head, it would kill you. That's what pretty many people had, and most of them were party lines. So we had kind of a perfect storm of bad things here that made this really a big disaster. And what happened was, this is the Broadhead Creek, and during the WPA period, it had been straightened to be used to make it easier to maintain as a right-of-way for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, which you'll see right there. There was actually a train with a couple of cars, and it's still sitting there, and you can see some of them are standing up, and some of them have fallen off, and they were pushed over by the water. At its regular width, this Broadhead Creek is this wide, about 30 feet across. At the widest time during the worst part of the storm, late on Thursday night, the 18th, it was 300 yards across. That's 3 football fields end to end, just to give you an idea. And this is up north, and you can see the really steep banks of the creek coming down, and of course everything was funneling into there. The problem was that before 1955, if you're a trout fisherman, you will know that this was one of the finest trout streams in the world. People came from all over. President Grover Cleveland came down and he would fish in it. Annie Oakley and Buffalo Bill used to go up to the Henryville house and stay and fish. And it was the 50s and not a lot of regulation, and it was the Pocono Resort. So people just kind of did what they needed to do to make their customers happy. And very often this included building a little unauthorized earthen dam to make the pools a little deeper so that trout would hang around longer. Nobody saw any big harm to it. And there is no big harm to it until you get an event like this. Then there's a really big problem. Because what happens is, for each one of those little dams, and there were about 20 or 30 of them, the water builds up a little bit behind it. And then it builds up until finally the volume's so heavy it pushes that dam out. But now you've not only got the extra 2 or 3 feet that it's built up, you've got all that debris that's being pushed out of the dam. By the time you got down here, about 10:30 on Thursday night, you had a 30-foot wall of water. That's a 3-story building full of stone and railroad ties and houses and people and everything you can imagine. So what you really have is a rolling excavator, just pushing right along, a bulldozer, if you will. And what it did was it ran into this little camp. There were about 14 little buildings, nothing really large. Most of them were military surplus Quonset huts. And there was one called the Big House, or the Winter House, and it was actually 1 story with an attic, probably no bigger than this room. And at the time, there were 46 people that were on this camp at around 7 o'clock. 3 girls left there, and they weren't supposed to, but they did. And they wanted to come over here to the camp because there was a male quartet playing, and they had pretty good reviews. So the girls thought, enough with the rain, let's go do something fun. And disobeying their guardians actually saved their lives, because they were 3 of 6 people that made it out of this camp alive. If any of you have heard of the Boy Scout camp that washed away in '55, it never happened. This is what really happened. I will cover a little later how it got to be the Boy Scout camp, but this story is truly, truly horrifying. And there are still whole families washed away, and there are still people in the Poconos who were related to those people. It's very different to give this presentation up there. So this is all that was left by the time they came. It was just a foundation of the Big House. And what happened was, about 10:30 at night, that wall of water came down. The people had gone up into the attic. They had realized by about 8 o'clock, what was going on, but by then it was too late. They could have earlier just walked across that little bridge and gone right across to safety, but they really didn't believe the water would come up that far. So they were all up in the attic. They were singing hymns, because it's the only thing they knew how to do to make themselves feel better. They had a little row of votive candles, lighting things, and about 10:30, there was a big noise, and they felt the house jump. And what had happened was it had been knocked off of its foundation. And the big puff of air that happened when it moved like that blew the candles out. So if you can imagine yourself up there, it's very, very loud. There's a roaring of the water outside. The house is being like machine gunned with rain. And all of a sudden everything goes dark for a second, and then they hear this other kind of machine gun sound. And what it is the entire house ripping in half and all the nails popping out. And the attic floor went like this and dumped everybody into this current, which has been estimated at 45 miles an hour. Obviously, nobody knows because the only people that were in it, most of them didn't survive. And that's what happened. So that's where the big story came from. And some of these people actually continued in the stream down to the Stroudsburgs. And this is the Stroudsburg, so it gives you an idea of how fast that water was running by the time it got down there. This is the Maplehurst Flats division of the town, East Stroudsburg. And most of these houses were completely covered in water. There might have been peaks of roofs sticking out, and if there were, that's where most people spent the night. And then this is the Day Street Flats area very close by. If you go to this area now, it's a beautiful greenway. It's a park, and there's a reason for that. And this is it. There are quite a few people who lived in these trailers and did not know this was coming and got washed away. And this is ironic. Right next to that park was the bingo hall, which was also refurbished by the fire department. They were very proud of it. They had just refurbished the whole thing. Ironically, this was designated as their civil defense headquarters, which is the equivalent to today's emergency management. There's a story in itself how it went from CD to EMA, but that's another story. But at any rate, there were people playing bingo in the hall at the time, and people came running in and said, "You need to get out, there's a flood coming." And no one believed that this would actually come up this far, and people stayed long enough that 4 women ended up being killed here waiting for their husbands to come give them a ride. So since they couldn't use that, they ended up using nearby Clearview School as the center, and unfortunately they needed to use it as a place to bring all those bodies in that they were flying out of the wreckage zones. And they learned a lesson during this, that using a school to process bodies has very long range effects, as in the kids don't want to come back in the building. So they learned not to do that. So it would be years in the Poconos before things got back to normal, and in some places they never did. This is the Delaware Water Gap that you're looking at right now. And for better or worse, right after the flood, of course, people were screaming for dams, and they cleared this whole place out, and they were going to put the Tox Island Dam in, but the Army Corps of Engineers finally admitted that even their own studies proved that the river geologically cannot support that kind of a physical structure, and because of that, it never got built. And it's really sad because some people were evicted from homes that their families had been in for 300 years, and some people killed themselves over it. But the end result is that we now have the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area that is not developed, even though the entire Poconos around it is. So I guess there's always a silver lining, and this is that one for this event. About 9 hours later, after the water comes down out of the Broadhead and dumps into the Delaware at Minnesink Hills at Shawnee Island, it comes down to Easton. If any of you have ever been in Easton anytime soon, what you're looking at right now is currently McDonald's. At the time, it was a Sunoco station. And if you look at the Sunoco sign, there was a little red light at the top of them, like there always is, and when at the height of this, that was actually the only thing sticking out of the water. So it would have been right here, and this entire level of this building was under. You can see the water line. This is when it had already started to go down. And this is if you were taking a look at the Lehigh River coming, looking from the Glendon Hills towards the Delaware. So the Delaware runs back here. And that water had actually come down from the Lackawaxen River, then dumped into the Lackawanna River, which then dumps into the Lehigh River, which then dumps into the Delaware. Easton is not a fun place to be during floods. And what you're looking at here is water that backed up in some places up to 5 blocks inland. And this is a mill building right here. And if you're familiar with these, those big eaves that stick down are actually at almost 3 stories high. They're about 2.5 stories, and this is about 3 feet beneath that. And this is one of the biggest casualties in Easton. This is the Northampton Street Free Bridge. Now there is a toll bridge just to the north of this, which the toll bridge stayed out of the water, but the approaches didn't, so it still didn't help. You could still not use the toll bridge. And what happened was, about 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the 19th, a big bridge that was like the last wooden covered bridge between Portland, Pennsylvania and Columbia, New Jersey, got pushed out by a couple of the colony houses from up north. And it the bridge was actually so incredibly well built that it only broke up into 3 pieces, which really says a lot for the craftsmanship. That is not something you want coming down the river after it's been broken up. And the problem is, it did continue down. 2 of the pieces of it went to the shore, and on the New Jersey side, someone actually salvaged that piece of the bridge after the event and built a resort with it, and it still stands today. But the middle piece actually continued down the river, and if you've ever been on the Delaware, you will appreciate how strong this current had to be, because it's a very shallow river. It's usually no more than 4 or 5 feet, in most places 10 feet at the most. So to actually float this like bridge that had a lot of oak in it was really something. Well, just after dark on Friday night, it came down and went through the center of this Northampton Street Free Bridge. And so there was a lot of people that knew, even up north of us in New York, because underneath it ran a cable about this big around that was full of telegraph, telephone, some rudimentary television wires, and Western Union cable. So I guarantee you that by Friday night in New York, they knew something was going on. They just didn't know what yet. When you get about 3 hours down south of that, this is the Regalsville Bridge. Now this is where I live. We take our flood gauge readings here. I am the weather coordinator for the Nockamixon Township Emergency Management, and this is where we take our readings. And when it hits 18 feet, we go into alert mode and start really monitoring. I can tell you that this year we have already been in alert mode 4 times. You don't hear about it until it actually floods, but we have, and it's a flashy river to begin with, and all this rain this year has just been really a little nervous-making. It's when it in 55, when we actually got here, it went up to 38.86 feet, so darn near 40 feet, or almost double what flood stage is here. But even at that height, all it did was come right up to touch the bottom. It did not wash over the deck. This is one of 2 bridges that actually survived this flood. And this is the other part of where that myth came from. There are 3 islands down in Irwina in the river. There's Treasure Island for the Boy Scout camp. There's Pennington Island, where Camp Wilson was, and the Presbytery of Philadelphia owned it. At the end of the summer, they would rent it to the Campfire Girls, and that's what you're looking at. And then there's Marshall Island, which is uninhabited. This camp was Campfire Girls at the end of the summer. On Treasure Island, the Boy Scouts were there. They were in section at the time. They had actually already evacuated their scouts early in the day through their own power. They had a little motorized scout with 2 very powerful engines, and it actually doesn't cross maybe wider than this room to get across to the Pennsylvania side. So they were okay. The counselors stayed behind to try to secure the camp. And what happened here is you're looking at a photograph that was taken out of the bay of a HUP 21 helicopter, the double rotor kind. I interviewed a couple of counselors and a couple of campers from this camp, and some of the campers told me that they had never seen a helicopter before. You got to remember, this is only 3 years after the Korean War, so most people have never seen one, much less been in one. And one of the girls was 8 years old, and she said, "Mary, I seriously looked at the top of the flagpole and thought, how long could I hang on instead of having to get in that until they could get a boat out for me?" But really what they ended up doing was they hovered at the helicopter and set it down as long as it was as they could on the island. And what happened was they ferried these kids in these canoes right down there. That's a counselor's head and shoulders, and there's the water line. And so you can see it's already about chest deep at this point. I'd like to give you just a little scenario on this one because it's really one of the more intriguing stories of this event. The night before, the kids went to bed, and about midnight, the camp director was called by the bridge cops, the bridge guards up north, and told, "You need to get those kids off the island." Fortuitously, the people who engineered the phone lines thought to put them underneath, run them underneath the river, so they never went out, thank God. So what happened was the CD director for Doylestown, which is the county seat of Bucks County, had already gone home for the evening and lived right next to the Neshaminy Creek, which all you have to do is blink at the Neshaminy Creek and it will flood. So it was long gone by the time this came about. So he actually directed this entire operation from his home on one of those party lines where they cleared the parties off and said, "And stay off until we tell you," because this is emergency stuff. And what this guy did was called up and down the coast and said, "I need helicopters and I need guys to fly them." Any of you guys from the military here? Okay, well, if you're from the military, you know you don't really mix Army and Navy in the same vessel, if you can help it. Well, that really went out the window, literally, on this one, because they had guys of all stripes, all uniforms. They piled them on. If you were able to fly one of these or crew one of these, you were on. They actually took helicopters off the manufacturing line at one of the Vertol plants and put them in. So we ended up having 21 of these craft evacuating these 3 camps. Now here's the thing. You're a camp counselor. You've signed up for a 3-month gig. You're 17 years old. You're going to have some easy money with the kids and go back to college, right? And at midnight they come wake you up and they say, okay, here's the deal. The island is going to flood. We want you in the morning to feed the kids and then line them up by height and put them into the bank barn. That's right here. That was the crafts barn. And they said, line them up by height. They said, yeah, because we're going to start loading the little kids first, and if we can't get them all off, we figure the taller kids will have a better chance of swimming. Can you imagine being told that at 17 years old? And you're thinking, I did not bargain for this. This is not what I signed up for. But it gets better for you because now you have to make 30 or 40 trips back from this bank barn all the way here to the bay of this helicopter. And then when you're all done, it's your turn. But guess what? You get a bonus because now we can't land the helicopter, the water's too deep. So we're going to hover over the top of you, and we want you to stand on the gunnels of this canoe. And by the way, it's not one of those nice, flat, old-town canoes. It's one of those like this that you have to do this on. Okay, so stand up on there, and we're going to throw you down a 3-inch hemp rope and hope that you did really well in Phi Ed, because that's how you're coming up here. And just to make it fun, we're going to be throwing a 74-mile-an-hour rotor wash down on you as you're climbing up, which, by the way, is a Category 1 hurricane. And guess what? They did it. Every single one, every single counselor, every single kid, they got evacuated almost 450 people off these 3 islands in an hour and a half. No casualties, no injuries. I think that's just really incredible. And right here is on Treasure Island for the Boy Scout camp. This is where the water is. You see that little thing? That's a shadow at noon, not real long. But they told them, by the time the water reaches the flagpole, you got 15 minutes. And there they are. They waited until the very last minute to pick them up because they had to get the rest of the kids. These guys were ready to swim if they had to, but they didn't. And here's the kids being offloaded up in the farmers' fields on top of the bluffs in Irwina. As you can see, very, very happy to be getting off of there. Because as they were coming over, they were just skimming the tops of the trees, and that bay door was open the whole way. And they didn't have enough seat belts for 17 kids. So they just sat in there. It was a really terrifying thing. Most of these kids, 400 of them, 50 were the staff. And these kids, a lot of them ended up staying in the fire department for 2 weeks until their parents could come across the river from Trenton to pick them up. And now we go down the river another couple hours and we're in Point Pleasant. This is on the Pennsylvania side of the river. This is the post office. Have any of you ever been down our way in Bucks County? This still is here, and that still is the post office, and yes, it has been underwater 3 more times since 1955. My friend Nancy's the postmistress there, so I get everything right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. I actually interviewed a lady who was leaving for college on this day, by the time on the 20th of August, 55, and she said the last thing she remembers seeing was a bunch of teenage boys diving off the top of here into the water just because they could. But I guarantee you that within a week, those kids all had really big sores on their body because there was a bunch of nasty stuff in that water. And now we're in New Hope. Now, if you go to New Hope right now, this would be Starbucks, and this would be a strange store called Love Saves the Day. But I want you to notice here, Bucks County Playhouse was in full swing. There's a really good story about that. It actually flooded during a performance during this flood, and that was a story. And one of the things I want you to notice is that they've got the boats pulled across here because, yes, people were trying to drive across the bridge to Lambertville. You never know, do you? You always kind of think maybe this is nature's way of putting a little chlorine in the gene pool. Okay. And now we're in Washington Crossing. Now, when I first moved here, if you've ever been across this bridge, it looks like a great big spider. It's really, really tall and has these spindly little legs holding it up. And when I first moved to this area, I would not cross this bridge. It was just scary looking until I saw this picture. I thought, well, if it can take houses slamming into it, I think it can handle my car. So that was the last of the colony houses from up north. And this bridge did actually make it, although it did sustain some damage. The Yardley Bridge, however, was not quite so fortunate. It actually had the entire 2/3 of its Pennsylvania side torn off. It was a 902-foot span. There's a fantastic story that I got about a guy saving a dog down here. Actually went out in the river and got it. If I had more time, I would read it to you. That's how I usually start it. But I couldn't put it in the book because I couldn't verify it independently with two, separate people. And as a conscientious historian, I just couldn't put it in the book, but it killed me to leave it out. So I usually read it, so at least it gets told. But it's it was, by the time it got down here, the river's widening, the current slowed a little bit, and everything was starting to build up. And by the later in the morning, it did just tear the whole thing out. And then they rebuilt it with what's called a Bailey Bridge. You guys from the military will recognize this. This is a wooden structure, and if you want to take a look at it, it's not a very safe-looking structure and doesn't really make you want to drive across it, but it actually stayed up until the 60s when they opened the Scudder's Falls Bridge on the Turnpike. Okay. Now this is the northern bridge in Trenton. This is not the Trenton Makes Bridge, but the northern one. Again, this went in 3 blocks and actually engulfed the Capitol building, and they had to go in and evacuate the legislature, which was in session, and they actually had to take the guys in boats off the Capitol steps, which I think is kind of funny. Okay. And this is actually the only picture of everything that you've seen that I took. Some people actually do ask me this. I'm like, do I look like I'm 80? Maybe I shouldn't ask. But this is the high water mark. It's still there. There's actually several of these along the river. This is Highway 32 on the Pennsylvania side, also called River Road, in between Lumberville, which was the picture that you saw at the very beginning, and Point Pleasant. And when I saw this, I first moved to there in about 1997, and I'd been coming here for 15 years and couldn't understand why I had never heard of this event. And the more research I did, the more I was horrified that no one had ever written about it, so I thought maybe that's something I should do, and that's how the book came about. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
On the Lehigh Gorge, there's railroad cars and old water, and back then it was called Boxcar Rapids. Is that related?
Yes, it is. There's a tunnel called Naog. If you're a railroader, you're very familiar with that. Naog is a tunnel because it's at the end of a gorge that has kind of a wall there. Well, when the water comes down, it just slammed right into it, went right through the tunnel, and pushed everything out of the tunnel that was in there. And there were some cars. I'm not sure if the cars were in the tunnel. There's actually a really great, if you Google Naog Tunnel 1955 flood, some guy wrote a fantastic essay on there. I tried to source from him, but I couldn't find him, so I couldn't use his stuff for the book, which just killed me because it's really great. There's a really awesome essay about that if you're real interested in it. Yes, sir?
Wasn't the Tox Island Dam originally proposed for keeping the Delaware Bay salt water out of the drinking water further south? It was for
The Tox Island Dam was absolutely, unequivocally the result of the 55 flood, and it was meant as flood control. But as you might be familiar with, it went until 1974 they went back and forth with this, and they finally put one of the Army Corps guys under oath and said, tell us what you found in your findings and your research. And they're like, okay, we really shouldn't build it here. You know, when you're a bridge building outfit, you want to build a bridge, you know. And when you're a dam building outfit, you want to build a dam, and that's what they do. Unfortunately, instead of doing the study before they cleared everybody out and took their land away from them by eminent domain, it was already a done deal, and there were dead people, and there were families that were split apart. I live down there, and it's a very sore spot for people. But people are now starting to really appreciate the fact that were it not for all that, we wouldn't have the Water Gap National Recreation Area, which is really incredibly beautiful. And it does actually do a lot to slow the water. I'm of the opinion that the Delaware is not a river that should be dammed. It really doesn't make sense. Rivers flood. It's what they do. And I'm sure you've all heard or read in the newspaper how many people down near us are clamoring for, you know, a dam, yada, yada, yada. And what it really is, and they don't want to hear this, but, you know, if you live in the floodplain of a river, you don't own your home. You're renting from the river, and it will come to visit. You know, it's the same thing about when they straightened that area on the Broadhead Creek. You know, yes, it's good for maintenance, but it's very, very bad for the ecosystem, and it's horrible during a flood, because the worst thing you can do is straighten a waterway, tear out all of the rocks along the bottom and all the vegetation, because you know what you've got? You've got a luge. And that's what it was like in '55. And that's why they had that really incredible current. And the thing is, you're only putting off the inevitable, because a waterway will eventually go back in. It's like us. All it wants to do is sleep in its own bed. And eventually it's going to go back there. And that's what happened. Yes, sir.
Are there any pictures of the canal when it was destroyed?
Yes. In fact, I edited those out of here so that I could stay within your allotted time. But if you go to 55flood.com, I am giving, and I tailor this presentation to wherever I'm at. So if you want to see all those, they're there. But you can also see some of the pictures are posted at the website. And I'm going to try to put some of those into the next edition that's coming out, which, by the way, shameless plug here, we've got fewer than 300 copies of the book left, and by the end of the year, these will be collector's editions, because it's the last of the first edition, so get them while you can. But I'm going to be putting out I'm working on a DVD right now, because I've got another, say, 350 photos I couldn't fit in the book, and people have just come out of the woodwork since it came out and brought me more. People were very generous about lending their personal collections for this. Yeah. Yes, sir. I don't know the actual. Like numbers. I do know that on the Delaware River, this is still the record setter, and I can tell you that I was here in '72 for Agnes and saw it, and I believe it's your worst flood yet on the Susquehanna. I might be wrong about that. So in that way, they're identical. They're both the worst floods that ever hit that particular river. I would guess that there was probably more monetary damage along here, because there's more settlement, and it was later, and more people were there. The river, the book covers Port Jervis all the way down to Trenton on both sides of the river. It actually flooded above there, and it actually flooded below there. But it wasn't so bad, because by the time you get past Trenton, the river really widens out, and it could really hold a lot more of that volume.
That was another question. I know Philadelphia it's a deep port, considered a deep port of Portland, because of big cruise ships coming to Philadelphia.
Well, to an extent.
Where's that part of Delaware in? Like, how far
Not very far, and in fact, there's a big fight right now. Excuse me, there's, I don't know if you're familiar with a group called the Delaware River Keeper Network. They get 50 cents of every one of these books that I sell, because I believe in what they're doing for the river. And unfortunately, right now they're in a big squabble with some people that want to dredge the Delaware to make it so that those ships can come further up into the port. But they keep skipping over that inconvenient little thing called an EPA study about how it'll disrupt the environment, and it really, really will. And they also are talking about taking whatever they dig out of the river and piling it up. Yeah, and piling it up down in Delaware, because I guess some of those people there don't have a lot of money and can't afford a lot of fancy lawyers. So how would you like to live next to a slag heap full of like 100-year-old fish leavings? Yeah, no, I don't think so. Any other questions? Okay, well, I thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be happy to sign a book for you if you'd like to get one. If you want to come by and ask me any other questions, I'll be here for a while. Thank you.
As we usually do, we'd like to show our appreciation, particularly to Mary, and for her presentation as well as her book. So we give her this bookstore presentation certificate. And as she had indicated, she'd be here for a book signing for a little while. I underscore the fact that if she's indicating there's 300 books left, it's pretty much a closeout sale at this point. I mean, at least with her first edition. So thanks for coming out to this afternoon's presentation. And I'd like to also just highlight for you our next presentation, which is October 21st, and that would be with former Governor Leader, George M. Leader of Pennsylvania. And that's going to be another big presentation as well. Keep checking pabookstore.com. We've got presentations now scheduled all the way through to the end of next year. Thanks very much.